production of this program has been made possible in part by a generous gift from the family of Helen Warren Cummings and honors her lifelong commitment to music.
From Public Radio's Morning Pro Musica, Mr. Robert J. Lertzema.
You know, in many ways, Vermont is synonymous with music. It's like a visual symphony. Whether it's the beauty of gardens at a house like the Park McCullough Estate, or the covered bridges and the farmlands and the majesty of the green mountains, it's no wonder that so many people are attracted here. Many of the people who come to Vermont are musicians. Well, they don't necessarily come here because they're musicians, although some of them do come here to make music. And many of the people who grow up here turn to music as well. They may not all choose to make a career of it. In fact, most probably have other careers, and so they look to get together to play, maybe little chamber music or maybe a full-blown symphony orchestra. It's the community orchestra that's really the backbone of the community in terms of music. And in Vermont, there's a community orchestra that's distinguished itself for half a century. It's an orchestra of which the state can be proud, and the people who love it proud. Something worth sharing.
Showtime. I'm sending the concertmaster out now.
So maybe we could get this started.
Okay, good.
At the heart of any symphony orchestra, beyond the vagaries of musicianship, past the momentary successes and failures of day-to-day rehearsal, performance, and ultimately public acceptance, there's a human reality that's as varied as the number of musicians who have traveled that orchestra's history.
Too many people worry too much about their professional identity. What you do for a living doesn't have to be confined to just one professional lifestyle. In my case, life as a cranberry farmer just happens to include being principal bass for the Vermont Symphony.
I'm a professional graphic designer. I'm also a professional musician. Both of these careers demand a tremendous amount of time, intensity, and just plain hard work. The way I deal with this is through something I call crunch time. It's a kind of a seesaw approach that allows me to devote my full time and attention to whichever side of my career demands it at that particular time.
You're going to be meeting every week on Thursday with all of the project leaders in R&D. To me, life is aesthetics, but it's very difficult to make a life in something aesthetic. The music and other aesthetic activities for me are probably the most important thing I do. I don't do it because I need to do it. People do it, but without something like that, it's all work and no play.
The Vermont Symphony story is mostly about the need to make music, somehow, somewhere, and often against all practical odds. For these musicians, as with dozens who have come before them, the reality of professional musicianship is a day-to-day matter of making ends meet, the legacy of a system unique to this country.
It never occurred to Vienna that they would look in Vienna for a Beethoven. They went out into the sticks and brought him in because they knew where the talent was. But this country, we got the idea that the big city was where it all happened. We don't yet know how to look to the internal strength of our own country for our own artists. But during the Depression, those things did start, and so art began to be performed and began to be found and began to happen.
To say that the Vermont Symphony Orchestra was started in order to save an antique Oriental rug may be oversimplifying a bit. But fact is, the orchestra's earliest patrons swore that that's precisely how it all began, one balmy summer evening in 1934. Here in the polite parlor setting of Margaret Williams' Woodstock home stood Alan Carter, on the verge of a decision that would forever establish a place for symphonic music in Vermont's cultural life. Born in Greenwich, Connecticut, Carter was a violin prodigy by age 6. His early studies culminated in an apprenticeship with the concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and eventually led to a 4-country European tour of study from which he returned to New York to assemble his own chamber music ensemble, the Cremona Quartet, all at the ripe age of 19. The year was 1923, 10 years before he'd meet a girl from Woodstock, Vermont, who would further shape his destiny.
I was brought up in a family of artists, my father being a well-known painter, but I'd always said I would marry someday a musician because music was my true love, really. And so I met Alan, and we fell in love, and here I had my musician.
The daughter of artist Rockwell Kent, Barbara's local social connections helped secure the Cremona Quartet's summer residency in Woodstock, where they held memorable concerts in a converted barn outfitted as a makeshift auditorium. Woodstock attorney Paul Borden was a young law student during those concert barn years.
In the summertime, I was engaged by Mrs. Pratt and her husband, who was a New York banker, to drive their car on errands and enterprises that Mrs. Pratt wanted to participate. And among those was driving her and others, friends of hers, to Kathleen Kent's barn in South Barnet, about 9 or 10 miles from Woodstock, where they attended the concerts put on by the Cremona String Quartet, of which Alan Carter was the viola player. In fact, he was the manager and organizer of the quartet, as I understand. And I had my law books in the car, and after I took the people there, they went in the concert, and I sat in the car and read law, but some of the time I listened to the music at some distance, to the quartet.
Listening to that music would ultimately lead to Borden's role as one of Vermont's early string bass players, but that's another story. One of Paul Borden's regular fares to the concert barn was Margaret Williams, then the reigning monarch of Woodstock culture. Mrs. Williams' support during Carter's early years in Vermont developed into an intimate friendship that would help launch Alan's major life's work. Alan Carter's euphoric leap toward a symphony of his own followed a particularly successful chamber music concert here in Kathleen Kent's Music Barn. As usual, the indomitable Mrs. Williams had once again seen to it that the ancient church pews and mishmash of hand-me-down furniture were filled for the final event of a series built around the Cremona Quartet, which in turn was built around Alan Carter, who in turn had begun to notice how many Vermont musicians were attending his concerts, possibly seeking solace from their musical isolation. If only he could channel all this musical energy into a single statewide effort. After the concert, Alan would often stop by the big White House on Woodstock Green to visit with Mrs. Williams. Only tonight, the conversation went far beyond the evening's performance. And so Alan Carter endlessly paced back and forth on that fragile carpet, raving about the symphony he wanted to start and how man could not live by bread alone. Margaret ordered Alan to sit down and stop orating, and perhaps they'd figure out just how to do it. He did, and they did.
Well, when the actual realization that indeed the symphony was going to materialize, well, it was a very dramatic and exciting point in Alan's life. His whole outlook changed, and he was a different person. From being rather depressed about his future, this was it.
The first step would be to woo the conductors of Vermont's existing instrumental ensembles by offering them associate status in a statewide mobilization effort. Within a short time, Carter had tapped the cream of the Burlington Symphony and Rutland City Band to create two main rehearsal sections.
The musicians from the northern part of Vermont rehearsed in Burlington, and the musicians from the southern part of Vermont rehearsed at Rutland. I recall the rivalries between the north and the south musicians, which made me laugh. They thought that they were far superior to the northern musicians, and we thought, vice versa. But it was all in fun, and we had a wonderful relationship. It was real friendly, and it was like a family affair.
It was an exciting and also, I must say, frantic time, this adventure of Alan's, involving much travel in our old Packard, all over the state, rehearsing a group here and a group there, and sometimes not be able to get home at night because of the weather. But there was a new life for us, and we loved it. It was exciting and rewarding.
With quite a number of concerted, if somewhat decentralized rehearsals under their belts, Alan Carter decided it was now or never. Vermont's new symphony orchestra booked their very first concert date in January of 1936. The inaugural would take place in the state's most centrally located performance hall, the Rutland Armory. In the history of symphonic music, there can't have been many concerts fraught with as many question marks as this one. For one thing, at the dress rehearsal, the Burlingtonians and the Rutlanders wouldn't even speak to each other. They allegedly eyed one another suspiciously the whole afternoon. And then there were the other little problems, like having no French horns and having to substitute saxophones for bassoons and a flute for a second oboe. By showtime, Carter was having serious doubts, as evidenced in his own account of the event. I arrived nervously about 5 minutes of 8, not knowing whether we would have an audience or not, how we would be received, whether or not the players would all appear, whether they'd be stage fraught, whether I would, and so on. I came out to start the concert. My knees were shaking inside my pants legs so violently that I didn't know for a moment if I could begin the performance or not. The baton fell, and we were off. The intonation was poor and the sound as rough as sandpaper. True, things were far from perfect, but there was a spirit that carried the orchestra along. It all clicked. My idea and dream had become a reality and was working. The evening was a howling success. We were launched.
Came off magnificently. Well, at least the reviews were rave. Alan was disgusted with the sound himself, but it was a beginning and a very triumphant one.
The debut was in every way imaginable an overwhelming success, as well as an utter surprise. The biggest surprise of all was that so many Vermonters were willing to leave the warmth and comfort of their hearths in response to a call to culture. Optimists had predicted an audience of 500. 1,500 came to hear the first breath of their new state symphony. Following the triumphant Rutland concert, Alan Carter had barely enough time to settle into a regular rehearsal and performance schedule before a flurry of national publicity began heralding the Vermont State Symphony Orchestra as a fascinating musical curiosity. Articles began appearing in the likes of Collier's, Newsweek, and Reader's Digest, reporting on the utterly marvelous phenomenon of a rural symphony made up of, quote, dirt farmers and dowagers in diamonds.
Playing was lifeblood to these people. They would go anywhere to play. That was their joy. Music is a joyful thing, especially with this kind of orchestra. This orchestra was the fun playing because it was where professional music of any kind was being played regularly. It was one of the many places, one of the few places in the state where you could go and really play with your fellows and brothers and sisters and play real music. And they loved it. It was the lifeblood to them.
Then came the event that put the Vermont Symphony in the history books.
In 1939, the Vermont State Symphony Orchestra was invited to attend the World's Fair in New York City. And I recall, after the announcement was made, most of the musicians, after the rehearsal, we kind of looked at each other with surprise, and we just didn't quite understand. We're going to play at the World's Fair.
Consider the fact that the World's Fair was by far the most spectacular international event of its day. Add in the relative remoteness of Vermont in 1939, and you begin to realize the pleasant bewilderment of those early musicians.
For most of the members of the orchestra, they never left the state of Vermont, to go to a city like New York was unbelievable.
A special car was engaged, which started from Burlington, and the people from Burlington in that area got on board, and also others from Montpelier.
And here we were, 7 or 8 of us, ready to get on the train. We didn't have too many instructions. All we knew that we were supposed to get off the bus, and we would be told to get on the train, and that happened. We got on the train, and as we got on the train, we immediately met other colleagues from other parts of the state, from up north, and the train stopped somewhere else en route to New York and picked up the rest of the musicians. And we wondered how many people would be there, because we had been playing in Vermont in small halls, and perhaps we'd been playing for 200-300 people, and we just could visualize, would we be playing for 10 people, 100 people? But I do recall the orchestra arose to the occasion. They really, I felt, outdid themselves at this performance.
And it was received. There were some notices in the paper that we had done rather well.
There was a little letdown here. All of a sudden, we went up to the top, and now we're back to the real world again. But I feel that by going to the World's Fair and performing as we did in 1939, that was what cemented the orchestra, made the orchestra be recognized as a solid musical organization, not only in the state of Vermont, but to be recognized throughout the eastern part of the country that we had something going musically here in the state of Vermont.
The World's Fair appearance generated much more tangible benefits than just spiritual uplift. The event provided the occasion for a landmark piece of legislation signed by Governor George Aiken, making the Vermont State Symphony the nation's very first partially state-supported orchestra.
Well, Alan, once you give Alan $1,000, you're going to do it next year, so he just got the idea that this would then become a state-supported orchestra. Now, it never really did, but he got that $1,000, which was very precious to it then, and he traipsed and he talked and he went to Montpelier and he argued and he was intrepid at keeping this thing going.
The 1940s brought an active performance schedule and a growing realization that an orchestra can't survive on just music and goodwill.
The symphony orchestras are the most expensive performing arts group outside of opera, and they are totally impractical if you want to judge them on the basis of economic viability.
In 1941, Carter proclaimed a Symphonies for All movement as the battle cry of his campaign to generate grassroots financial support wherever the orchestra performed.
It was welcomed, appreciated, but not supported by the local people, because one way or the other they were supporting their own thing. And so the idea was to try to find a way in which people would adopt this orphan and everybody would take his share of the support. And that effort was tried, and off and on, haltingly, without success, for years.
As threatening as finances were to remain throughout its 50-year history, the only thing to ever actually stop the Vermont Symphony would be World War II. The musicians would hear the news of Pearl Harbor while driving home from a concert. A week later, Carter would announce an indefinite suspension of orchestra activities.
Alan felt he must contribute, so he enlisted as a music officer in the Special Corps. He dealt with mostly bands and so forth, and planning, setting up music programs in the Army. He was very homesick for his home as well as his symphony and his real work. Well, then the war was over, but it wasn't easy. You can't just pick up pick up from where you left off as easily as that. It was about a year before rehearsals resumed. And then, from then on, it was got better and better.
Key to the Vermont Symphony's post-war development was Alan Carter's uncanny ability to draw a venerable array of guest soloists. In the case of an orchestra of limited means, the attraction had to be other than financial.
Indeed, Alan was quite respected in the musical world, and he had many important musical friends, backers in the field of music. So he was able to get well-known artists as guest performers who gave their services because they believed in his work, his project.
Alan was a music maker. He wanted, music to him was a festival, a party. He would do anything to arrange it. He was very good. He was a very good conductor. He was very knowledgeable about music, certainly the most in this state, and enough to make an impression on other artists so that they would come. He was not a flamboyant conductor. He was not a disciplinarian. He was a party giver, and and the essence of his party was music.
With the advent of television, Maestro Carter seized the opportunity to bring his music directly into the living rooms of Vermont. The concept would represent the earliest form of local cultural TV programming in the state.
He was using it, and he was using it very, very well. The scenes that come to mind are the transformation of WCAX television studios into a concert hall on Sunday afternoon. That was Alan Carter doing a very fine job of innovation.
Possibly Carter's most important and lasting contribution to regional broadcasting was the introduction of instructional programming for Vermont school children. Again collaborating with WCAX, he created a series of music instruction programs that represent the earliest example of educational television in the state. Having successfully weathered more than 3 decades of precarious finances, in 1969, the Vermont Symphony found itself facing the looming specter of bankruptcy and dissolution. Unable to fend off a growing list of creditors, a desperate Alan Carter reached once more into his bag of contacts in search of a savior.
As I say, you can always find someone to save a symphony orchestra at the last minute, and the orchestra was indeed in dire straits. The trustees were at their wits' end, and there were bills unpaid, and so the orchestra, in effect, was dead. The smartest thing I may have ever done was to get Dean Davis to come in as chairman, and he worked extremely hard over the reorganization of the orchestra and the organization of the orchestra as an operating program with responsible funding and a program to get the funding annually.
My purpose was, of course, to keep the symphony alive until we could find new blood, new interest, new people, younger people to come in and take it over. At least it seemed to work anyway, and it did stay alive.
As the years proceeded, Alan was getting on, and he had to think seriously about a replacement. He had had a slight heart attack at that point, not a severe one, and that left him rather depressed about everything. Physically, he was depressed, but depressed about his baby, his symphony, and finding someone who would take his place that he really believed in and trusted.
Carter's successor would come in the form of a young Argentinian with a similar love of contemporary works.
At a certain point in my career as a conductor, I became known as able to premiere contemporary music. I did get a call to guest conduct the Vermont Symphony, and I guess the point was that they wanted to see also my approach to classical music. I did come, and eventually, after a very successful concert, I was asked to move to Vermont and help developing the Vermont Symphony. Any orchestra has been one time or another in the situation of the Vermont Symphony the way I found it. It was now needed perhaps a step forward, and it was a time of development. I accepted the challenge. It was a question raised in my mind: what do you do? Do you go out and raise money before, or you try to make it musically, to develop it musically, and then the money would eventually come? And actually that last approach was the one that we all opted for, and it made a complete difference in the sense that by now we were every one of us, very concerned in trying to develop a fully professional orchestra. That made immediately the difference.
Becoming fully professional also meant staffing a modern office to handle the nuts and bolts of orchestra operations. The administrative linchpin of today's VSO is the orchestra manager.
I look at managing an orchestra as enabling other people to network and to communicate with each other. The manager is dealing with the board members and with the music director and with the musicians and with the rest of the staff. And those groups of people all operate a little differently from one another. And it's important to have someone making sure all the communication actually takes place and that the follow-through takes place.
Then there's an assistant orchestra manager. In addition to contracting musicians, organizing armies of volunteers, and playing second oboe, Eleanor Long just happens to be the Vermont Symphony's music librarian.
Did you find it?
Yeah. I know that we've played this before with Betty, but I don't think Rory has ever played it with us.
Well, why don't we get, do you have another first violin part?
It takes an awful lot of music in a given year to make up all the different programs we play around the state, and we do have to borrow or rent or buy some of it as we go. Gigi will let me know in advance what we need to get, and I'll call around and make sure that it's available to get out to the musicians in time.
Okay, what I've had the typesetter do is we're resetting this entire line here so it's all equally spaced.
Good.
Rather than spacing it by hand.
Good, good, good.
And then it'll be perfect up here.
And then you may need to eliminate the bottom part of it like this to put on the brochure.
On the brochure, we're not going to have the the date.
No.
After nearly 5 years, Freddie Levin's job as orchestra publicist has evolved to a breaking point. She's the first to admit that something more is needed.
More creative ideas to keep people excited about the symphony. And to do that, someone needs to be a full-time. I've been hiding under the word public relations because I've been loath to say I'm a marketing person because I don't see myself as that. We're going to get a marketing person to market the symphony in a more sophisticated way, like some of the bigger orchestras. It's time to really bite the bullet and say, we're grown up now, and let's do it right.
Nice guy. Why don't you call him up and ask exactly what you need to do in the way of an application, and also I think it's really important to find out when their decision-making process.
Possibly the most crucial responsibility of all falls on the Director of Development, a task that's come a long way in 50 years.
It's really amazing when you think that in the early days of this orchestra they could survive on $500 a year. And as a matter of fact, we have a story of a trustee being absolutely outraged when they came up with a deficit of about $100 or $150, and this trustee resigned. He couldn't accept that fact. And today we have a $700,000 a year budget, and obviously it's a wholly different operation. But because we've been doing this now for a couple of years, we have a strong network, and we have lots of people who've been giving to us over and over again, and who realize that the orchestra is really something special to Vermont, and who are committed to that.
In 1984, the Vermont Symphony began a unique year-long celebration of its golden anniversary. Poetic justice came in the form of a concept right out of the Carter legacy.
How do you celebrate the 50th anniversary of a regional orchestra like the Vermont Symphony? And actually, thinking about Alan Carter's, the founder of this orchestra, about his dreams, when he said a symphony for all, what he really meant it is to take symphony music to all people in Vermont, to every corner. We opted for the 251 project, which is simply based on the 251 towns in Vermont. The idea was to send music to every one of those towns.
A lot of people said, oh, no. But a few people said, yeah, this is it. And somehow we have to make it work. It does sound like a massive undertaking, and maybe the practical matters are going to be earth-shattering, but not insoluble.
And so the musicians set out in groups of 3 and 4 and made their way to nearly every town hall, Grange Hall, and central church in the state of Vermont. Their message was share the joy of music, and the familiarity of the setting quickly broke through any unfamiliarity with what was being played.
I mean, you never knew, and the musicians never knew quite what would happen when they would go to these places. Great questions got asked. I mean, from really basic things like, why do you have, an extra valve on your trombone?
I want to ask, what's the thing that you push with your thumb?
When you push this down, then the sound travels through this extra tubing.
Oh, I see it adds.
Right, and then on. So it adds more tubing, which means we can get lower notes.
251 was, somebody said, it was the best thing that ever happened to Vermont. I know it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I think it might have been the best thing that ever happened to lots of the musicians.
No, wait a minute. Crescendo means piano, pianissimo. It is far too loud for 8 measures crescendo.
Rehearsals claim the bulk of an orchestra's time and energy. It's here that the conductor asserts full artistic control in building a piece of music based on a master plan.
Basically, I take a score like a blueprint of an architect, and it is our mission to guess, and after analyzing, guess right if possible, the intentions of the composer. Please, the very last quarter note.
Musically, the major challenge for a regional orchestra is making do with impossibly limited rehearsal time.
You have to taper down all the time the half notes I ask, and some don't do it. Absolutely, look, only the strings at the very beginning, only the strings. And listen what is happening, the drama that this means he will do it. Yeah. One danger that we never had, and perhaps never will have, the Vermont Symphony, is like in some major orchestras, musicians complain that by the time of the concert, the symphony was over-rehearsed and it becomes almost boring. That it won't happen with the Vermont Symphony. We were always able to succeed in presenting a very exciting performance, thanking in great part to the high motivation of the musicians, their dedication, that they would come to the first rehearsal very well prepared with the notes, and leaving the job of the conductor basically what it should be, to take care of the conception, the tempos, the phrasing, the unifying of the piece of music. Tapering down, but always move the ball. No, don't stop the ball. Always sound. And tapering down, but always sound. Everybody, beginning. There is a very special motivation, and we work, our motivation is only music making, and somehow that is reflected in very exciting performances.
In the end, it's the performance that really matters the most. The bottom line on any symphony orchestra, the sum total of its history, of years of toil and triumph, all of it leads to one place and time, the next concert.
The production of this program has been made possible in part by a generous gift from the family of Helen Warren Cummings and honors her lifelong commitment to music.
For more classic programs, visit vermontpbs.org/fromthearchives.